So, thank you for inviting me here. And I would now like to speak about memorials in Germany. And as my title is Memorials in Political Activism, but after the presentation yesterday, I think I will speak more about memorials and political engagement. But we will go. So, what are the tasks of memorials nowadays? It is possible for them in a rapidly changing world, one that is everywhere plagued by populism, to focus on their traditional function of remembering and commemorating past eras, or should it also be their task, if not their obligation, to take part in public debates and become political active? Memorials, of course, are already used for political ends, being put in the service of this or that discourse whenever a public figure visits. So wouldn't it be better for memorials to openly engage in politics? Is it enough for them to educate the public about atrocities in the past and commemorate the respective victims, or should they make it a point to address present-day crimes as well? If so, how should they go about this? Before getting into these questions, I would like first of all to go into more detail about how the memorials in Germany came into existence, what counts as a memorial, and what role they are meant to play. It is clear in historical perspective that memorials resulted from political activism, which to my mind more or less obliged them to play a part in public debates in their capacity now in many cases as a well-established institutions. It has also become apparent, however, that many institutions and initiatives are wrestling with the question of what their radius of action is and how they can best make use of it. So now coming first to the history of memorials in Germany. In West and East Germany alike, concentration camps were sometimes completely destroyed after 1945, often to prevent a spread of infection diseases, whereas others continued to be used as camps. Only the occasional commemorative marker erected at the initiative of survivors served as a reminder of those who had died and the injustice suffered there. By the late 1950s and early 1960s, institutionalized state-sponsored memorial sites were set up in the GDR, in Buchenwald, Sachsenhausen, and Ravensbrück. The first memorials in the Federal Republic, by comparison, were set up starting in the mid-1960s on the initiatives of former prisoners and with much lower subsidies. In West Germany, this changes in the late 1970s and especially in the 80s, as the number of visitors increased at several memorial sites, along with international interest in the history of Nazi crimes and the fates of persecuted individuals. Numerous local initiatives, or so-called history workshops, we already heard about the history movement, often comprised of lay but also trained historians, emerged around this time. They researched both the local archives and private legacies, collected diaries, letters, private photographs, and interviewed witnesses with the aim of shedding light on local history, particularly during the Nazi era, and making their results accessible to the public. They also took it upon themselves to set up memorial sites where violent crimes had been committed. These activities were usually financed by private donations to begin with, and most of the work was done by volunteers, amounting to a kind of political activism, as they often encountered resistance from local politicians. Starting in the 1990s, the memorial landscape in Germany transformed once again, as memorials increasingly attracted the attention and earned the acknowledgement of policymakers and the public. This was evident on the one hand in the participation of high-ranking politicians at memorial events, but also in better financial support at the local and state level. So, if work at memorial sites was primarily a form of civic engagement in the early days, state funding eventually resulted in a more professional approach, with renowned historians and educators now investigating the history of these places, preparing exhibits and developing educational programs. The number of visitors had risen in the process. Visits to memorial sites have become an inherent part of school curricula. But the spike in visitors has also included an increasing number of individual tourists, especially at the big memorial sites, now at Dachau, Sachsenhausen, Buchenwald, for example. So, but what makes a memorial site a memorial? What are exactly its tasks? Memorial sites are places where people were, now quote from Habo Knopf, who just published a book about memorials, and he defined it as places where people were tortured and murdered as the victims of generally state-sponsored systematic violent crimes. Quote end. In Germany, these are mostly former camps and prisons from the Nazi era, the Soviet occupation zone, and the GDR. After 1945 and 1990, respectively, institutions were established at these places to gather documents and preserve the remnants of local history, to provide information to visitors at the sites as well as to commemorate victims. But memorial sites are also a visible reminder to not let it happen again. Exhibits and educational programs embed these sites in historical context, explaining the interworking of politics, society, and individual fate. For this reason, the International Holocaust Remembrance Alliance also refers to them as contemporary history museums. In 2012, together with the International Committee for Memorial Museums for Public Crimes, the Alliance adopted the International Memorial Museums Charter, outlining 10 key principles of memorial work. The focus, in a nutshell, is to protect these sites as their historical remains, to engage in the scholarly study of the history of these places, and communicate relevant knowledge to the public, to evoke empathy with the victims as individuals and groups, to address the perpetrators of these crimes, and thereby create a pluralistic culture of remembrance with a view to universal human and civil rights. There's no mention is made of fighting populism, revisionism, or extremist movements. And yet it is not unreasonable to expect institutions commemorating crimes of the past to address injustices committed in the present. But how then can the work of local memorial sites make a contribution to this? So, memorial sites often make reference to the notion of universal human rights. But does this make them places of human rights education rather than places to communicate historical knowledge? Can they even perform this task at all? Does the knowledge of crimes committed in the past make people more sensitive to crimes in the present? In the 1970s and 80s, there was still a great deal of optimism, especially in the newly emerging initiatives and history workshops about the possibility of memorial sites functioning as centers of historical and historical and political education. There was a firm conviction that the right-wing scene could best be fought with the monocausal lessons for history. Even in the late 1990s, in a declaration on right-wing extremism and xenophobia in the Federal Republic, the working group of concentration camp memorials in Germany emphasized that memorial sites were places of educational, political education where one can learn what the disregard for human rights and the loss of democracy might lead to. It was therefore essential, they concluded, to strengthen political education at memorial sites. They viewed the mere visit to a memorial site as an expression of rejecting right-wing extremist behaviors and called on representatives of state, economy, and society to visit them more often and thus promote their acceptance among the population at large. But the notion that memorial sites were an educational authority working against right-wing extremists didn't bear out. Right-wing extremist tendencies continued to spread in the Federal Republic. In 2018, the yearly annual memorial conference, a discussion took place about what the electoral victories of a right-wing, in essence, anti-democratic party would mean for our democracy, as well as for the work of memorial sites dedicated to the victims of Nazism. More specifically, the question was asked if memorial sites for the victims of Nazism should join forces to become politically active, and if so, how they should go about doing this. Jens Christian Wagner, the managing director of the Lower Saxony Memorial Foundation and now the director of Buchenwald and Mittelbau-Dora Memorials Foundation, saw the quote, protection against historical revisionism as the core business of memorials. Also, he himself is certainly one of the most active and outspoken individuals in this memorial scene. In the public fight against right-wing tendencies, he failed to galvanize the memorials into any kind of joint political action. The concluding statement of conference participants merely pointed out once again that their own memorial work constituted their respective contribution to fend off right-wing political aspirations. I shortened my presentation, we will come to an info. So ultimately, there have been hardly any political declaration in public by memorials, let alone political activism. If anything, employees or directors have made sometimes public comments, but always in their capacity as private individuals and not in their role as memorial representatives. Leading the way here is the above mentioned Jens Christian Wagner, who has spoken freely in newspapers, on the radio and Twitter, the latter, to be sure, using a private account with a disclaimer in a private capacity here, personal opinion. The political activities of memorial sites otherwise take place in the context of their memorial work, on location as it were. It is here that they take a stand and push back. For example, against visitors who show revisionists used, removing them from the premises and or barring them from future visits if necessary. However, their focus is on, the memorial focus is on their historical and political educational work, relying on historical learning and the relevance of the past to present-day issues in a pluralistic society. So they, in short, the memorials decided that the visitors should be encouraged to question their own political, ethical, and social behavior in modern day life, and motivated them to reflect and act in an ethically sound way. They should become the activists, not the museums. That doesn't mean forever, because the memorials are still on every conference, they are still discussing and about being on public. And every more or then they ask themselves, should we do something outside of our memorial walls? But I think, this is my thesis, these are the costs when they became professional. They are no activists anymore, and they dare not to behave like them. And therefore now last question to the audience. Do you think it's a German phenomenon or is it in other countries the same? Thank you.